As I mentioned earlier, this is the hardcore group, July 4th weekend. We're still here, ready to learn. And even though we were kept up until 2 a.m. from all our neighbors' fireworks, our wonderfully patriotic city that we are. Also, next month, August, we will be off. Okay, there will be no class. We'll pick up again in September. Okay, so we're in the 3 weeks, which is the time period between Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, and Tisha B'Av, the 10th of Av. These 3 weeks mark a very sad time period in the Jewish calendar. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz was when the city of Jerusalem was besieged. It was the beginning of the end of the Second Temple, and Tisha B'Av is, as we know, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Talmud teaches us, the sages teach us, the reason for this horrible destruction and all of the things that the Jewish people suffered during this time period for the second Beis HaMikdash, the second temple, which was, why? Sinas Chinam, baseless hatred. Right? So this is a very special time period for us to be working on, the attributes that we've been talking about for the last 9 or 10 months or so, and that we continue to work on, which are living with God's attributes of mercy. And if we live with those attributes of mercy we've talked about, that is a special way of inspiring, I guess, if you could say, God to act that way with us. So this, and as we know, that within spirituality, whenever there is a potential for a positive, there's potential for a negative. So unfortunately, in our history, during these 3 weeks, we did not tap into the potential of positive, and we tapped into the potential of negative, of not loving our fellow Jew, not caring for each other the way that we should. But if there was that negative spiritual component, that means that this time period has the potential for the positive of that same spiritual component. And so many of the Hasidic masters suggest that the cure, the antidote for sinat chinam, which means baseless hatred for free, is ahavas chinam, which means love for free, love for no reason. Okay, now that sounds beautiful, but listen to this, because one of my rabbis, Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz, would say that as beautiful as that sounds, he says there's no such thing as ahavas chinam. There's no such thing as loving a fellow Jew for free. You know why? Because there's no such thing as a Jew that there isn't something he or she is worth loving. So the concept of loving for no reason is beautiful, but he says that just means that you're blind. You're not seeing the person for who they are, because everyone has something that they're worthy of love for. Okay? So that's the 3 weeks and the time period that we're in now. So as usual, we'll start with a recap from last month. And we talked about God's midah of chafetz chesed hu, that he desires kindness. And God's desire for kindness is so overwhelming and so powerful that when we're told about the time period for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the destruction of the temple, it says that God tells Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, to take ashes from between the cherubs. So in the Holy of Holies, you have the ark, and on the ark, you have these 2 cherubic statues out of gold. So just as we had a temple down here, there is a temple up in heaven, and Gabriel goes to reach for these ashes, and there is a hand there, and the hand holds the ashes. And this hand represents the idea that even though the Jewish people had all sorts of sins, and they had all sorts of baseless hatred with each other, they still had the hand of chesed, the hand of kindness. And because there was this loving kindness, therefore, instead of grabbing ashes directly from the fire, there was this in-between. There was this hand that cooled things down. And so instead of the Jewish people being totally decimated and destroyed, now it was only going to be the stones of the temple and the land of Israel that was going to be destroyed, but the people would survive. Okay, unfortunately, we know not all the people survived, but the nation of Israel would survive. And then Gabriel paused for 6 years. We're taught that he paused for a long time, again, giving the ashes time to cool down because of God's love of kindness. And so it's almost blinding if a person has the midah, the attribute of chesed, and the desire to do, and the desire to be kind towards others. It is so powerful that it calms down the rage and the fire of God, even when it is absolutely deserved. So that was the midah, God's attribute of chesed. Chafetz chesed hu, that God desires loving kindness. And we talked about the story of Rabbi Chia in the Talmud. And Rabbi Chia had a wife who, unclear, maybe today we would say that she was struggling with a mental health illness or something like that, but she would intentionally, publicly antagonize her husband, Rabbi Chia, all the time. Whenever she had the opportunity, there are some crazy stories in there in the Talmud of what she would do to antagonize her husband. And it says that Rabbi Chia, every opportunity that he had, he would buy gifts for her, out of love and appreciation for his wife. And so at one point, his students challenged him, and they said, "What are you doing? This woman has it in for you. She makes your life miserable. And yet, every opportunity you have, you're buying her gifts. You're not getting anywhere. This relationship is not happening." And he said, if all that she did for me was that she raised our children and she protected me from sin, that would be enough that I owe her never-ending gratitude. And the idea you see from Rabbi Chia is that he appreciated and recognized every act of chesed, every act of kindness. Even this woman who was making his life miserable in some ways, he was able to appreciate and love her for the kindness that she had shown him and the kindness that she had done. And one of the points, I believe we made this point last month, but if we didn't, it's worth mentioning now, which is in Chovos Levavos, Duties of the Heart, which was the book that we glossed over a little bit before this series that we started now with Tomer Devorah, is that he says when developing trust in God, he talks about, for every attribute, he talks about first faith, believing in God, and then the desire to serve God, and then having trust in God. And he says there are many things that will hold a person back from developing trust in God. And one of the things he mentions is a point that we here in this series are addressing. And that is that if you don't really understand who God is, you won't be able to trust him. You won't be able to trust him. And there's a classic line, and I know somebody well, personally, a good friend of mine, who is an atheist into his 40s, and he will tell you today, the God that he didn't believe in his 40s, he still doesn't believe in today. Right? That God he doesn't believe in, because that was not actually the God that we believe in Judaism. And as he learned more and understood more, he realized, I can buy into that. I can believe that. And as Rambam in Mor Nevuchim, Maimonides in his book, The Guide to the Perplexed, he says, you cannot believe that which you cannot define. Again, you cannot believe that which you cannot define. So if someone says, what does it mean that you believe in God? And you say, I have simple faith. I just believe. Okay? In Judaism, Maimonides teaches us, if you cannot define what it is you believe in, that's not belief. You can't believe in something that if you don't know what it is. So, yes, belief means I cannot mathematically prove it to you. Okay? It means that I can't tell you just like 1 + 1 = 2, that God exists or that this is what God is. I can't prove it to you mathematically maybe, but if I can at least define to you what it is that I'm talking about, then I can't say that I believe in it. I can't say that that's faith. So, we're addressing that issue in this class as we talk about God's attributes of mercy. And we might have questions or maybe evidence that seemingly contradicts these definitions and these attributes of God as we're talking about them. But at least now we can define what it is the Torah teaches us, who is God, so to speak. So talking about Chafetz Chesed, how much God desires kindness. So we mentioned, think about one of the first interactions that we have in the Torah. First of all, the first of our forefathers is Abraham, his attribute was chesed, was kindness. This is not coincidence. In the order of the forefathers, you have Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Each one had a different core attribute or core midah. And the first of the fathers, which is Abraham, His attribute was kindness. It's not a coincidence. It had to be that way. It had to be that the foundation of our nation came from kindness, came from Abraham. And the next point that we mentioned was, where does God appear to Moshe? The first place that we have a revelation, a conversation between God and Moses, he appears in the burning bush. Does anybody know what type of bush it was? A thorn bush. Why is God appearing in a thorn bush? On so many levels. And the fire, there's a lot of deep messages and symbolism that's going on here. But why is God appearing in this lowly thorn bush? And so Rashi points out there, Rashi says that God was sending the message to Moshe and to the Jewish people, Imo anochi betzara, I'm with you guys in your pain. I am down in the thorns, in this lowly bush. That's where God says, that's where I am. If the Jewish people are enslaved, I'm feeling that pain. I'm there. Okay, so that takes us through some of the conversations that we had last month about Chafetz Chesed Hu. And that was Midah number 6 out of the 13. And now we move on to Midah number 7, God's attribute, the 7th attribute, which is Yashuv Yirachameu. We'll loosely translate it as He will again show mercy. But I think that as we develop the concept and the class today, we might walk away with a slightly more robust definition about what that actually means. So this is another one of God's attributes of forgiveness. And the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the author of the book that we're studying, he points out a contrast to how human beings work versus how God's forgiveness works. So if someone, think of, maybe this has never happened to you, but if it hasn't happened to you, I would be very surprised. Think of someone who has really, truly, deeply hurt you. Okay, not just like a passing small thing that we can just say sorry and move on, but a real deep hurt. And now this might not have happened to you in your life, but maybe it has. This person came back and offered a genuine apology. Okay? Now, where is the relationship today in correlation to where it was before this person wronged you in the first place? Non-existent, even after the apology.
Oh, no, they didn't apologize.
They did not apologize.
No, or it was a half-hearted apology.
Half-hearted apology. Yeah? Where's the relationship now? One of convenience. It's not what it used to be. Not what it used to be. No way. That face tells me never. Never again. Right? It's better than it was before?
The way the person acts, the way the person thinks, and I'm able to interact better with
You understand them better through that experience. So, God's attribute of forgiveness, of Yashav Yirachameu, that means He not only goes back to a point of, I don't hate you, but He goes to a point where the relationship is better off than it ever was before. So, if you look here, and then we'll go back to the previous slide, look here at the letter Hey. Okay, letter Hey, the 5th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and it's a very cool thing, by the way, the significance of the various letters in the Hebrew alphabet. I just saw a very powerful idea about the letter Bet, right? It's the 2nd letter in the alphabet. So what letter does the Torah begin with? The first word, the first letter? It's a Bet, Bereshis, in the beginning. So there are many, many explanations. Why does the Torah not begin with the letter Aleph, the first letter? Why is it starting with the 2nd letter? There are many explanations, but I just learned a new one this week, which is that in life, typically, we put everything first that's not Torah, right? I have to make a livelihood, I have to take care of my family, I have to take care of myself, and the list goes on. And then, when there's time, when there's any leftover energy, okay, so now there's Torah, now there's religion, now there's God. So Torah starts with the letter Bet and says, no. What you would naturally put as number 2, that has to be number 1. Okay, so each of the letters, there's a tremendous amount of depth and meaning behind it. So the letter Hey, the sages teach us, it's brought down in the Talmud and in the Midrash in many places, that the world was created with the letter Hey. Hey is one of the letters of God's name, Yud and Hey, Vav and Hey. So the world was created with the letter Hey. So how are we supposed to understand this? What is the meaning for us? So if you look at the shape of the letter Hey, the bottom is completely open. And this is representative that everything in the world is inviting us to fall. Everything in the world is an opportunity to sin. It's a challenge. It is pulling at us to go in a direction that we shouldn't. Very, very easy for a person to fall through the cracks and never get back up. Okay? Sounds pretty depressing. However, we've talked about the concept of challenge before and how actually important it is and beautiful it is. However, there's another hole in the hay, which is in the top left corner. And that hole is there, it's an opening, that anyone who wants to do tshuva, anyone who wants to return to that intimate bond and connection with Hashem, can always do so. They can always climb back up and enter in through the top. So the world was created with the letter Hey because it's open on the bottom, you have the freedom to fall, and yet there's also the opening at top, which always gives you the opportunity, inviting you to come back in. Now, here's an interesting question. Here's an interesting question which the Ramak discusses, which is, why do I need two openings? If it's open on the bottom at all times, so I fell through here, let me come back in through here. Why does there have to be a second? The letter Ches goes all the way down, it's closed. So maybe that should have been the power that the world was created with. Let me crawl back in through the way I came in. The way I fell is how I'll go back. You following the question? Everyone following the idea? So he says the answer is because once a person has fallen, once a person has gone in a certain negative direction, they've breached the wall. The wall is weak now. To go back to where you were before will mean you'll just slip right back down. If a person has accustomed themselves or normalized certain behavior, to just go back to the place where you used to be before that was normal means you're just going to fall right back down again. It's a very thin fence. And so the person who has breached the wall and has broken the fence and wants to rebuild and wants to come back to God has to come in through the top. They can't hang out anymore back at the bottom here. They can't hang out here where they used to be because now they've fallen here. If they come back here, they'll fall right again. So they have to hang out up here. They have to go back to the top. That is the idea of the Baal Tshuva. The one who has done tshuva, the one who has repented, has to work very hard to build stronger walls, to build a deeper foundation, to crawl in through the higher opening. So there's two aspects to this, the Baal Tshuva. Number one is that coming back in the first place means putting in far more effort than the person who never struggled with this in the first place. So already the Baal Tshuva, the one who is returning to God, having fallen, is ahead of the one who is righteous always in that area because of the effort just to get back. And number two is if they want to stay there, they have to work much harder. They have to live in a different playing field. They have to live in a different frame of reference. I remember a while back there was somebody who asked me, he was discussing why the rabbis placed boundaries over certain mitzvot and not around certain other mitzvot. And he was very bothered. There was one mitzvah, one command, I'm not going to get into details, that he really struggled with. And so he asked me, why are so many things around this prohibition permitted when it's so easy to just slip into that? And so the answer was that I think most people didn't struggle with that particular issue as much as him. But for him, he did have to put extra boundaries around that particular thing. Because he had transgressed it so many times, for him to keep it safe and to guard it, he had to work a lot harder than the rest of us. He had to create more boundaries. He had to do more. So to bring out this idea, imagine that you're sitting at the king's table, or the king calls in all of his advisors for a conference of war. And you have in the room the smartest, most successful people in the entire country, each in their own field, whatever it is, right? Economics, strategy, etc. And so each of them have a very special place at the table because of how hard they've worked and what they've earned to be there. And then the king's son, who is 14 years old, is sitting at his right hand. He has zero expertise, zero experience, nothing intelligent to add to the conversation. And yet, he sits the closest to the king. And so this is going to be an idea to bring out the difference between the tzaddik gomer, one who has been always righteous in a certain regard, and the Baal Tshuva, the one who has repented. So the tzaddik gomer, the righteous one, maybe is highly intelligent, has earned a special place at the king's table for living a life of piety. And yet, the Baal Tshuva, who has sinned and done all sorts of stuff that means he shouldn't be in this room, doesn't matter. God says, you're my son. You get to be here. If you have nothing to contribute, I don't care. Just your presence here is contributing something. And I would point out that each of us are probably the tzaddik gomer, the totally righteous in some aspects of our life that we've never struggled with and have always been good about. And in other areas, we're the Baal Tshuva, right? So this is not the entirety of a person is either the sinner who's returned or the totally righteous. We're all in some areas one and in some areas the other. In fact, the Talmud actually relates a very similar story to this. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, and there were two rabbis of the Talmudic era, and this is the really pre-Talmud. This is of the time of the Mishnah, so we're talking about over 2,000 years ago. And one of their sons was deathly ill. And so he was praying and crying and fasting for days on end. And nothing was happening. So he went to the other rabbi and said, please, my son is deathly ill, would you pray for him? And immediately, the second he started praying, the kid got better. So the wife of the first rabbi was very disturbed by this because she had tremendous love and respect for her husband as a Torah scholar, and she believed that he was far greater than the other rabbi. And so she asked him, I don't understand. Is he so much greater than you that you pray for so long and you're unanswered, and the second that he opens his mouth, suddenly our son gets better? And he said, I am like a trusted advisor to the king, but he is like the servant in the king's bedchamber. In other words, yes, I am a great Torah scholar and I have tremendous knowledge and I have that strength, but I only get called into the king when he needs me. Not that God ever needs us, but specific times, specific opportunities where my talents are necessary, that's where I'm called into the king's room. But the other rabbi, he's the servant that's in there day in, day out. And maybe it seems like he's lower, but at the end of the day, he has the king's ear because he's there every single day. In other words, if a person is totally righteous in a certain area, there's an advantage to that. But if a person is a Baal Tshuva, if they have sinned and they have returned, there's an advantage to that. And that is a closeness deeper and higher than the one who has been totally righteous in that area can ever reach or can ever achieve. And so therefore, says the Ramak, says Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, a crazy, unbelievable thing. And the deeper we get into this book and the deeper and higher levels of God's attributes we get into, the more unbelievable living them seems to become. And yet we can do it. But he says, therefore, when a person has wronged you and they apologize, you have to find a way to love them more than you ever did before. It's an unbelievable thing. It truly is an unbelievable idea to be able to rise above what has happened in the past and not only repair the relationship or be cordial, but to actually bring it back to a level. And I'll tell you something. Every time we learn together and every time I sit down to prepare for this class, it's such a good thing for me because it forces me to rethink my life and to think about relationships that I have and people that maybe I haven't talked to in a while. And it inspires me, and I'm about to get up and talk about forgiveness. Who have I not forgiven? Who have I forgiven? This is a very, very powerful, hard work that makes us literally like God himself. So, to bring out the idea, think about, if we haven't been teachers, we've all been students at some point, but I see a number of teachers in the room. And think about the first day of class, right? You walk into the first day of class, and you're unbelievably optimistic. Unless you've talked to the teacher of this class last year, then maybe you're less optimistic. Okay, I made that mistake my first year. I taught first grade for a little bit, and I was wondering why they were offering me such a good price, like such a good salary to teach this class. I'm like, I've never taught before. I don't really have the credentials, but they want me to teach first grade Hebrew. I'm like, okay. And then after day one, I called the previous teachers, and I understood good and well why they were so desperate, okay? But you walk into class on that first day, and you're optimistic, and you're excited. This class is going to be better than ever before, and these students are going to be perfect, and you've perfected your curriculum, and you have so much planned, and what you're going to accomplish, and how much fun you're going to have, and at the same time teach them so much, right? You walk into the room with all of that. And day after day after day, there's that one kid. And we all know that one kid. And I have to tell you, that one kid growing up in my class, I still am trying to forgive him for this, because he now is actually an unbelievably huge Torah scholar and teacher, okay? But it's like, you think that you could be that whatever when we're growing up, and now, okay, but so there's that one kid every single day disrupting the class, ruining the hours of prep that you've put in to teach the class every single day. And then it's like a month before the end of class, and the kid comes over and says, I'm so sorry for how I've been behaving. I feel terrible. And the kid seems to genuinely mean it, okay? But it's been 8 out of the 9 months of school with the same behavior. And you walk into the classroom the next morning, and not only are you supposed to be as hopeful, optimistic, and passionate about teaching as the first day of school, but more so than ever before. Because this kid has turned a new leaf. Right? That's what we're talking about. That's what we're looking for. Now, I want to make a point here, which is oftentimes we justify or we rationalize why we don't live this way, because we say that to live with that attitude or that perspective is stupid. Or think about happiness. Why don't we just focus on the good? Why do we focus so much on the negative? Because we're afraid that if I don't pay attention to the negative, my life won't get better. I won't improve myself. I won't improve my surroundings. So I've got to be obsessed with all the bad stuff so that I can make it better. To be happy is not to be stupid. To be good and forgiving and loving is not to be stupid. This doesn't mean that now I'm not going to protect myself. I'm not going to be cautious of the fact that this kid is very capable of being the biggest troublemaker in the room, okay? We'll still live smartly. We'll still take appropriate precautions. We'll still think things through. But at the same time, yet, just like we can find with happiness, I'm not pretending that the bad stuff isn't there, but I'm choosing to focus on the good. So also here, when someone apologizes sincerely, and you feel like they sincerely want to make things better and make it up with you, try and find a way to open your heart to love them more than ever before. That doesn't mean forget necessarily what happened, but it does mean forgive. So another wonderful example, imagine, and this is very apropos, it's July 4th weekend, for example, and your neighbor thinks that it's a great idea to teach his children. I'm going to change the example a little bit because this example was not for this weekend, but works out very nicely. Your neighbor decides it's a good idea to leave his kids lighting fireworks in their backyard, which is right next to your, it's right next to your hedge. Okay? And so you run outside and you warn him, this is a very bad idea. You are going to set a fire to the entire neighborhood. It's like, oh no, it will be fine, and we're going to be careful, everything will be good. And lo and behold, your wife is, or your husband is looking out the window, and there's smoke coming from your hedge. And thankfully, she calls 911 in time to save your house, but your yard is destroyed, and it was a close call. Your house almost burned down. Okay? Now, neighbor comes back, promises you and follows through, and repairs all the damage, and everything is fixed, and apologizes profusely. Okay? Now imagine about a year later, and you cross each other in the street, which happens very often, and your neighbor says, "Good morning," with a smile. And you say, "Good morning. Nice to see you," right? And then you run quickly into your house and avoid that awkward situation as much as possible. Even though the person has paid you back and has apologized and genuinely means it, the reality is like, dude, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? I told you this was going to happen. It happened. You did it. So how do we work on this? How do we work on this? Because the human nature to not really truly forgive and not to love back, and certainly not to love more than I ever loved before, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, maybe it's not an intellectual, logical making sense, but it makes sense. Okay, that human nature is normal. So how do we work on that? How do we try to overcome that? So I think that there are two important things to pay attention to, which is really one idea, which is think to yourself about the last time that you knew you owed somebody an apology. Okay? I don't have to think very hard. I usually have a few examples every day. Okay? And then think about how long it took until you actually apologized. Sometimes, maybe quickly, but the worse the thing that you did was, usually the longer we procrastinate making that apology. It is hard. You have to break your ego. You have to really be self-aware. You have to be truthful with yourself, not to justify and rationalize why what you did was right or why what you did is okay. Break all of that down and show up to the person and lower yourself in a way before them and offer an apology. It's hard work. Think about how much the person must care about you and the relationship if they're willing to go through all of that to make an apology. If they're willing to break themselves that much to apologize to you, that shows a lot of love. It shows a lot of value and appreciation for your connection. And I think thinking about that, really taking a moment to think about it. There are so many things. We talked about this in the Pirkei Avos class yesterday. There was a Mishnah we learned which seemed to be common sense. And so my question was, if we know this already, why does the Mishnah have to teach it to us? And so the answer is, there are a lot of things that we say, but we don't really believe. There are a lot of things that we know, but we don't really believe. And all the difference between saying it and knowing it and turning it into something real is just a few moments to sit with it and to think about it. So sit with it and think about it when someone apologizes. What an expression of love and appreciation that is. And I think that could be the first step to repairing the relationship on your end, to forgive and to renew the relationship and bring it to a higher level. So let me tell you two stories, and I think that will be how we'll close today's discussion. Okay? And then obviously open to questions and comments and so on. The first story is a story about Harry Ashkenazi. Harry Ashkenazi was a man who lived in New York, as just about no Jews would ever actually consider doing. Just kidding. So he was a Syrian Jew. He lived in Flatbush, and he's on his way to a wedding in Shari Tzion. And as is common in New York, driving was incredibly frustrating and stressful. And there's this car right in front of him who is driving unbelievably slow. I mean, the woman was driving the speed limit, for God's sake. Okay? And so Harry says to himself, this is ridiculous. So he drives around the car, bumps up a little bit on the curve, pulls ahead of her, and carries on his way. 2 blocks later, he returns to the synagogue, pulls into the parking lot, and little did he know that this woman was a Jewish woman from his neighborhood going to the same wedding. And he got the last parking spot because he cut her off. And it's freezing cold winter day or winter evening, and he has the last parking spot, and she has to circle around in Flatbush looking for parking and walk a few blocks in the freezing cold. Okay? Now, a few months later, it's almost Rosh Hashanah, and Harry's thinking about his year and everything, and this story was just, it was eating at him. He felt so guilty and felt so bad that he did this to her, and she had to walk because he cut her off, and the whole story. He tracks her number down, he finds out how to get in touch with her, calls her, and says, hi, I don't know if you know who I am or if you remember me, but do you remember the wedding for so-and-so and the whole story? And she was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I totally forgot about that. He's like, I'm so sorry. Will you please forgive me? I'm so sorry. Will you please forgive me? And she was blown away. She had forgotten about it. Now that he reminded her, she remembered how frustrating that had been. But she forgot about it. She moved on with life. She didn't really know him. They were in the same circles, and she said, absolutely, of course I forgive you. No problem. And then she went to sleep that night, and she's thinking to herself, you know something? Who do I have to call to ask for forgiveness? And so she started making a few calls, and she started calling people that she hadn't talked to in a while, and started bridging some relationships. Years go by, and in the Orthodox world, maybe some of you are familiar with the shidduch system. So matchmaking, right? And you don't have to be in the Orthodox world, you just have to be Jewish. If you find a Jewish boy and a Jewish girl, oh, you must be for each other, right? And so, guess who is suggested for her daughter? Harry Ashkenazi's son. And so now they share grandchildren. And had he not called her back to apologize, she probably would have seen that name and said, no way, what a jerk. But because he called back, not only did she forgive him, but she was so impressed by the fact that he called and remembered and repaired that relationship that she was thrilled for them to become family with each other. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. Yashuv Yerachameu, that not only does the relationship go back to where it was, which in this case was pretty minimal, but it goes further. They became family. They became close. One more story I'll tell you. Maybe I should have started with this one because it's not quite as heartwarming as the other one. And I may have mentioned this story before, but I recently reheard it, and now I know the people that were in the story. Okay, because there is a Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg, an unbelievable rabbi in Boca Raton, Florida, who I met this year at the RCA convention in New York. The Rabbinical Council of America puts a rabbinic convention together every year, and I met him, and we've been in touch with each other, and so I had heard this story, and now I know that it was his wife. So his wife was traveling with her father, and they were going to visit their kids, so the Goldberg kids, in camp. And her father was a Holocaust survivor, and they're walking in camp, and there's another man old enough to be a survivor who's also there visiting his family. And as they pass each other, her father looks at the man and nods his head, and then keeps walking. And she's surprised, because she knows, so she thought, all of her father's friends. She knows his circles. She's never seen this guy before. So she asked him, who is that? He said, oh, don't worry about it. And she kept bugging him. And finally he said, that was my best friend before the war. When we were living in Romania, that was my best friend. And she says, that was your best friend? And all you did was nod your head? You didn't want to go over and talk? And he said, don't worry about it. She said, go over and talk to him. You haven't seen him in decades. don't worry about it. Back and forth. Finally, he said, okay, listen. Before the war, things were getting bad. And I got visas for my entire family to be able to escape to America, just in case. And I hid them in a specific place, and the only person in the world that I told was my best friend, because I knew I could trust him. And as things got worse and worse and worse, it hit a point where I decided, okay, that's it, we have to go. And I ran to the hiding spot to pull out our visas, and they were gone. Who could have taken them? There's nobody in the world who knows where they are except for this dear friend. And yes, this friend had taken the visas and escaped with his entire family. And so she asked her father, and what happened to your family? He said, my wife and children were killed in the Holocaust. And then she turns to him and she says, that's the friend? And you're able to look him in the eye and give him a smile and a nod? And listen to this, because he turns to his daughter and he says, it's my fault, because I gave him a test that he couldn't handle. I shouldn't have told him about those visas. That's God's attribute right there. And a human being is capable of living it. Yashuv Yirachameu is that not only do we have to try to forgive, but when someone asks for forgiveness, we have to love them more than we ever did before. And God willing, with that, may we merit to see God's presence in the entire world and return to the third temple, to the third Beis Hamikdash. Everyone should enjoy the rest of the summer, and I'll see you in September. Okay, we're off next month for August. Thoughts, questions, comments?